So I am continuing. This is sort of a tentative. I'm hoping this will be a series. I think this is going to be a series. It'll go over Lent, and I haven't totally timed it to see if it's going to coincide with Easter, but we'll see how it goes. So I'm continuing with Freedom Through the Wilderness, Part 2. We've been reflecting on this idea of wilderness and Exodus and what is wilderness and what does it mean to us. And this season has kind of been, or is, a wilderness season. This week has been another one. At the top of the headlines, there has been the tragic violence in the Ukraine. And I know a number of people have experienced some personal hardship in their own lives. Health challenges again for Christine and Real. Heather lost her auntie Agnes. Rod lost his father-in-law, Dave. And earlier this week, I also had the tragic news that one of the kids that I have known and worked with I knew this girl since she was about 9 years old through CK, and she was not a super consistent part of our Wednesday night youth group, but she was a part of it somewhat regularly. A couple years ago, she drifted a little bit over the last couple years, but this last week she was tragically killed in a hit and run at the age of only 19, leaving 2 young children. Tragedy. Part of this season, wilderness and unexpected, totally unexpected. And what do you do when it's unexpected and it lands on you? It's, part of our thing this year has been finding God in all things. And it was weird because on Wednesday night, when I typically do youth, some of this was landing on me pretty heavy, the loss of Angel. And Christy and I are hanging out together watching TV. And the TV show we were watching, there's a guy on the show, and he is in critical condition. He's an older guy. On the show, he'd lived in an iron lung for 60 years. I'm not going to tell you what an iron lung is. You're going to have to look it up. But anyways, he's close to death. And he comments to another character on the show. He says, "We all live on the edge of a knife. Only some of us know this better than others." And it really got me thinking about that, with some of the recent loss. Like, we never know when it's going to happen. We never know when we're going to face it. And it's often sudden. It's often tragic. It hits us. We all live on the edge of the knife, and only some of us know this better than others. And I think this is why we intentionally need to look around and appreciate all of our gifts, the people sitting around us, our family. Despite some of the losses that we have had over the last 2 years, we still live in a wonderful country with so many opportunities. We have so many gifts. We have so many privileges. I think we really need to embrace one another daily. And really, practice gratitude. On top of all this, we're continuing to move forward towards this new normal that I don't think anybody knows what that means yet or looks like yet. Restrictions are starting to lift to a degree. Some people are really celebrating this and embracing it. Others are not so sure. They're not sure that they're ready to give up distancing and isolation and masking. They're not sure if they're ready to give up the precautions. And sadly, in too many ways, the polarization kind of continues. It seems so hard to get a good understanding of what is going on with so many people. And there are so many different camps that are throwing up their hand and saying, "We have the truth." And it's like, "No, you don't. We have the truth over here." "No, you don't. We have the truth." "No, you don't. We've got it over here." It can be a real challenge to find a healthy perspective and a healthy way forward. And these thoughts have really lingered in my head this week as I've spent time with Jesus, reflecting, reading my Bible, and praying. And yesterday, this isn't generally one of my favorite parts of Jesus to read, but I felt like I needed to yesterday. I spent some time reading and reflecting on Matthew 24, which is really Jesus' teaching in the end of days. Like he's talking about the future, but he's talking about the end. And it's hard to understand. It's a little bit cryptic. Some of the signs, until they happen, we don't really know what they mean. And people have been debating it for hundreds of years, and we still don't totally know. But it is a teaching where Jesus is he's talking about the future. And the disciples, they want to know what's going to happen. They want to know what to expect. They're like, Jesus, explain it to us. And Jesus, he tells them, I encourage you, if you maybe go read Matthew 24 yourself, but this is what Jesus tells them. He says, guess what? You guys are going to hear a lot of rumors. A lot of people are going to claim to have the truth. But Jesus says, don't get carried away by it. They don't really know what they're talking about. Don't be misled. Don't let fears and worries distract you unnecessarily. And this is kind of crazy. Like, again, with so many people insisting, we have the truth, we know. Jesus himself in verse 36 says, guess what, guys? I don't know. Jesus himself said, I don't know. He said, I don't know exactly what's going to happen. He continues, the angels don't even know. Only God knows. So trust him. So I especially in this season with so many, conflicting voices, I think, we need to lean into Jesus. We need to trust him. We need to be careful about getting carried away and don't let fears or worries distract us in an unnecessary way. We can trust God. One verse that really jumped out at me, this is the big warning. Jesus says, don't stress it. I don't even know what's totally happening. God knows, but trust, and that's okay. But he does highlight this. In the midst of confusion, this is his one big warning. It's in verse 12. He says, unfortunately, in this time of confusion, for a lot of people, their love will grow cold. That's what he's concerned about. He's not concerned about figuring out all the particular details. He's like, I'll leave that in God's hands. But I'm worried that people's love is going to grow cold. And I think, I think that that's still relevant for us now. Let's not get so self-absorbed or so distracted by what's going on that our love and care of others gets neglected. Let's not circle the wagons and whatever, just, start looking out for ourselves because we're afraid of what's going on out there. Let's not let our love grow cold. Let's love one another. Let's not neglect one another. Let's not neglect gathering in the ways that we're comfortable with. And I do think that really the best thing to do in confusing times, and I think this is our invitation in this season, is to really seek God's heart. God really is the only unpolluted news source that we can go to. As soon as you put a human being in the process, well, there's going to be problems. Every human being is broken to some degree, and every human being brings their brokenness into a certain degree. The only unpolluted news source is God. Let's press in prayer. Let's trust him. And I think that we do need to remember that it's often in these confusing in-between seasons that we can find our greatest invitations to grow in trusting God, our greatest invitations to depend on God. And I think we need to try and remember and live this out. This was part of my devotional reading 2 days ago, if I can get the clicker to work. Oh no, clicker, please work. Oh. There we go. Psalm 75:3. When the earth quakes and the people live in turmoil, kind of like life on this planet recently, God says, I am the one who keeps the foundations firm. To us, it's turmoil, it's quaking. God's got his feet up. I'm the one who keeps the foundations firm. So, this is where we need to pray. Lord, help us to be steady like you are. Through your Spirit in us, let your love overflow again and again and again and again. And as things continue, we have jumped into this season of Lent, and it is this traditional season in the Christian calendar where we often give something up in preparation for Easter. And again, I think many of us already feel like it's been a long season of suffering and uncertainty, and I don't know how I feel about giving something else up right now. I'm wrestling with God with that one. But despite that, I still want to take time to reflect on the Lenten journey. I want to dive into it. I want to dive into the journey and the promise of Jesus, and I would invite you to join me. I do think that the sense of loss, to whatever degree we have it, to whatever degree we've experienced it over the last couple years, I think it might help us engage Lent this year in a deeper way if we let it. Part of the intentional focus of Lent is really remembering Jesus' own 40 days of trial and temptation in the wilderness. Jesus himself had a wilderness experience. He walked through it. Jesus himself had to pass through a crucible of hardship to learn and practice trust and dependence on God. And I think this is just part of the human condition. We get stuck or we experience something really difficult, and then we look to God for help, and he brings us help or encouragement in some way. In some way, he offers us a degree of rescue. And in our humanity, we hope that this rescue is going to be like this automatic transportation from all our problems. He's going to take us right out of our difficulty to the promised land, and everything's going to be peachy keen. No more hardship, no more struggle. But that's not usually the case. We often find ourselves wandering in some sort of wilderness experience. The wilderness, the in-between, the unpredictable, to learn to trust and depend on God, searching for a path towards the promised land. Jesus himself walked through the wilderness a couple of times. Now, there's the one main time that often gets associated with Lent, his 40 days of trial before his ministry. Can anyone think of another specific wilderness event for Jesus? Give you a hint. He couldn't even walk yet. Yeah. When he's got to flee Herod, when his parents have to flee Herod, they had to flee through the wilderness. They fled to Egypt, which might ring some alarm bells if you're remembering the big Bible story. In Matthew 2:15, it says, "This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son." God's people, there's this weird connection with Egypt. There's this reminder of a bigger story. Out of Egypt, God still calls his sons and his daughters. Last time we reflected on this, I shared this quote by Alistair McGrath where he says, "The Exodus tells our story." This is the story I'm referring to. The Israelites in Egypt, the Exodus tells our story. Each of us has a personal journey to make from our own Egypt to our promised land. We have left something behind in order to make this journey. We have had to break free from our former lives in order to begin afresh. We were in Egypt. We were delivered from bondage. We are in the wilderness on our way to the promised land. The story of the Exodus involves us because it is about us. In many different ways, sometimes over and over again, we travel through a wilderness because we need to learn the lessons of the wilderness. The wilderness is often our crucible of transformation. Now, I know that this isn't really a fun line of thinking, but I'd like to challenge you to consider ways in your life that you might wrestle with forms of slavery. Think of some things that might have you bound. Think of some things that might have you tied up in knots. Sometimes this can be because of outside circumstances. We can feel trapped in situations that seem to be imposed upon us. We didn't choose it. Life circumstances that are making things hard for us. But sometimes we're actually also slaves to ourselves. We get trapped in patterns of thinking and feeling that can rob us of greater freedom. We can be slaves to image or appearance. We can be slaves to substances or relationships. We can be slaves to compulsive behaviors and abusive systems. As free as we'd like to be or imagine that we might be, each of us continues to wrestle with what the Bible calls the old self or the old nature. Read Romans chapter 7 and 8 particularly. Paul talks about this a lot. Unfortunately, without even realizing it's happening, we get stuck in old ways of thinking and acting. We get stuck in old patterns of thinking, in old patterns of acting, and we don't even realize it. Author Pastor Ian Cron said that no prison is more secure than the one that we don't know we're in. You know, we might feel free getting up, going to work on our own schedule, coming home, doing what we want. But all of us, if we're honest, there's parts of our lives where we feel stuck or bound. We're not free. In some ways, there's a bit of a prison experience, and often we're oblivious to it. We haven't recognized it. We don't get the dynamic. Now, if you guys remember the story, this is actually what happened to the Israelites when they ended up as slaves in Egypt. It didn't start out that way. We remember Egypt, they were slaves for however long, but how did they end up there? It wasn't like, hey, crazy idea. We've been free for however long. God promised us this home. I know, let's go be slaves. You know, they did not go and embrace that reality. Originally, Egypt was a place that the Israelites were protected. It was their salvation. They were experiencing famine. They went to Egypt and they flourished there. It was a place of provision and safety and nourishment. For years, the Israelites found safety and security in Egypt. Life in Egypt began with great hope and possibility. When they got there, their chosen son, Joseph, was like the second in command. They were the favored people. Egypt was awesome. But what started out as a good thing got out of balance and eventually led to a bad thing. And that's how this process often works for us. That's what makes this subtle deception so powerful in our lives. These eventual enslavements, they actually connect to good things. You know, God has built good things in us. He has built good desires in us. And often in the pursuit of those good desires, something goes a little wonky. Good desires and longings somehow turn into enslavements. Well, how does that happen? Well, in his great essay, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis helps us understand how the pursuit of good things can sometimes trap us. Part of what eventually led C.S. Lewis to faith, he really struggled with coming to faith, and part of what led him there was that he recognized in his own life that there was this longing, there was this drive, there was this thing in his heart that was compelling him towards good things. Beautiful things. For him, it was almost like a memory of some great beauty. It was like the sense of something, but he never really fully experienced it. He felt like he was always chasing it, but never finding it. It was the center of his life. In some ways, it was his God, but he could never grasp it. He eventually realized that he was mistaking beautiful things for the truest beauty itself. And this is what he wrote. He said, these things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, they are good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, and I think here he's talking about if they're mistaken for God, if they're mistaken for God's truth, then they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers, for they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower that we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited. You know, for all of us in certain ways, I think we felt a touch from God. We felt God's presence. We've encountered him in some special way, and yet, as far as I know, none of us have actually been to heaven yet. Not yet, but sometimes we get tastes of it. But again, what is it that we are pursuing? And are we mistaking the beautiful thing or turning to the beauty of the thing instead of the truest beauty itself? Good images of things we really desire. Actual God-given desires, but somehow they can get disordered or out of focus. This story of distorted, twisted goodness, it goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Broken human beings take good things and twist them, and then they end up getting themselves all twisted up in the process. It's a story of desire, good desire, but desire never completely satisfied. Reflecting on this idea, psychiatrist and theologian Gerald May, he said this: "There is a desire within each of us, in the deep center of ourselves that we call our heart. We were born with it. It is never completely satisfied, and it never dies. We are often unaware of it, but it is always awake." We might need to recognize that sometimes our everyday struggles with addiction, idolatry of various things, money, popularity, security, or maybe enslavement to various kinds of brokenness, they're really the result of a kind of search for goodness, a desperate search for life, a desperate search for love and acceptance, a search for home. We tend to think of sin and brokenness as just bad. Avoid, avoid, avoid. Don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But sometimes it might be more helpful to recognize our brokenness as a symptom of disordered affections. It's a broken desire for something that actually really is good, a symptom of disordered good, distorted good. Sometimes we need to see and recognize how much God loves us and accepts us first before we can find the strength to leave our Egypts. Human beings have always had a hard time seeing God as he really is and accepting his love as it's freely offered. This is why Jesus gave the Pharisees, these religious experts of his day, he gave these guys such a hard time. They were supposed to help the people see God, and he gave them a hard time as guides. He's like, you guys aren't doing a very good job. You are the experts. You're the ones that are supposed to show the way to Jesus and reveal Jesus, reveal God's heart. You're supposed to be leading people towards better seeing and accepting the love of God. And instead, you're making it harder by piling up lists of do's and don'ts and guilt and shame. Sometimes seeing and recognizing, accepting the grace-filled, unconditional love of God, sometimes that is the hardest battle of all. To really believe that God just loves me, to really believe that God just accepts me, that freedom and that invitation is really there and I don't have to strive. Part of our human brokenness is the insecurity that some part of us is broken. When we're all alone in the dark, I'm broken. This fault. I'm flawed at my very core. There's this interior voice that causes us to doubt and discourage who we are and how we've been created. And I think that this is the voice of Satan. The Bible calls him the accuser, a liar who seeks to take God's truth and twist it. Taking the Christian story and the one that we tell ourselves, and he weasels his way in there and he re-narrates it in his own way. And we see this over and over again in the Bible story, whether it's in the garden as the serpent in the wilderness or with Jesus in the wilderness, giving all these promises that he can't deliver. There's this voice. Jesus had to face this voice, trying to re-narrate, twist the story. And that same voice tells each of us that somehow we are a design flaw in God's good creation. We need to remember that God's first thought when he created human beings was that we were very good. Beginning of the story, that's what it says. Saying, well, not bad. It was my first try at people. I guess I could have done better. No, he creates people and he says, you guys, in my image, you're very good. In order to understand our brokenness, I think, in a healthier way, we need to first grasp our original goodness. Understanding our goodness does not mean that sometimes feeling guilty is necessarily bad or wrong. Sometimes guilt can actually be a good thing. It can be like that internal warning system that something is wrong, something's off track. That original intended goodness has somehow gotten off track a little bit, like the flashing light on the dash of your car. Guilt can actually warn us that a course correction is needed. But sometimes the lying voice seems so loud that a simple course correction doesn't seem good enough. Henry Nouwen wrote that the real devastation of the brokenness of sin is that it has this capacity to erase our memories. Again, it re-narrates the story in an unhealthy way. It causes us to forget who we really are and where we really come from. He said, the real sin is to deny God's first love for me, to ignore my original goodness. Because without claiming that first love and that original goodness for myself, I lose touch with my true self and embark on a destructive search among the wrong people and in the wrong places for what can only be found in the house of my Father. Like the prodigal son, we need to go home. We need to recognize that we are more than welcome and experience the deep cleansing of love and forgiveness. I love this quote by Parker Palmer. I love how it really marries humility to our true worth in God's eyes. He says, we need a coat with two pockets. In one pocket, there is dust, and in the other pocket, there is gold. We need a coat with two pockets to remind us who we are. Created from the dust, but we're God's kids. In his eyes, we're gold. But we struggle to hang on to that truth. And that's what we see happening to the Israelites in Egypt. They were God's people. They were his children. And not just normal, average children, they were children of his promise. It was this miracle promise to Abraham. They were children of promise. Miracle, like God's divine whatever was all in the mix. The Israelites, they were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the people of the covenant. That was their true story. That was their identity. But they were all of them deceived, for another ring was made. Joke. I couldn't help myself. I had to throw that in there. Okay, different story. But for the Israelites, slowly and steadily over the span of 4 centuries, a different story supplanted the original one. A different story began to shape and form their identity. The Egyptian story, a story of slavery and oppression, a story they would have a really hard time shaking in their future journeys towards something better. And I think in some ways, we might need to remind ourselves of this. Right now, with some of the political stuff going on, Canada and Canadian freedom, or the lack thereof, they are not our true home. Nationalism, whether it's Ukrainian, Russian, wherever, yes, we want to stand for justice, but nationalism itself misses the bigger point. We are kingdom people. We are God's children. The kingdom of God is bigger. It's better. It's more beautiful and true. It transcends national boundaries. So why would we want to trade that for something less? And it's sometimes, again, the Bible calls us, how does it, calls us citizens of heaven. We're foreigners. There's another term I'm missing right now. You guys might remember it. But that's our true story. That's our true identity. But we get stuck in some smaller ones. I'm an Alberta boy. I was born and raised in small town Alberta. So, I'm not a city kid. I grew up small town. So I ate dirt for breakfast. I love the West. I love adventuring in the woods. I love to hunt. I love the mountains. I served 10 years for our country in the Canadian Forces. I represented Canada, living in Europe for a couple years. I did a peacekeeping mission in Kosovo with the Canadian flag sewn to my shoulder. One of my sons, Josiah, I don't know where he is right now, but Cy was actually born in Canada's oldest incorporated city. When Cy was born, we actually got a special, he got his normal hospital birth certificate, but then we got an honorary one from the mayor of St. John. He's an honorary citizen of the city of St. John, Canada's oldest incorporated city. So I am a proud Canadian. completely. But then, 6 years ago, as part of my fitness journey, I did some genetic testing, and it showed me my true ancestry. It didn't come back saying, hey, you were born and bred on Molson Canadian. No, it didn't say you're 100% Canadian. My genetic ancestry says that I'm about 72% British and Irish. Then I'm about 20% Scandinavian, with about another 6% being a Northwestern European mix. Finally, a small part of me is actually Iranian. I have about 1% of Iranian, Mesopotamian, with a small dose of Coptic Egyptian. Well then, what the heck am I? Am I Canadian? Am I Celto-Viking? I like to pretend I'm Celto-Viking. Am I Celto-Viking? Or am I simply one of God's many diverse kids? The things in life that bind and shackle us are a place where we forget our noble roots as image bearers created in goodness. We forget that we are born in and for love. That original story gets twisted into lesser loves and lesser desires. And over time and through disappointing life experiences, we forget who we really are. We get stuck in these areas of bondage. We risk losing our true story, and we can start to believe the false narrative that we are a design flaw. Israel's love affair got started innocently enough. In a time of hardship, Egypt became a safe place. They found a form of protection and security there. But over time, a subtle change took place. The voice of bondage started to tell them that they were stuck, started to tell them that they owed everything to their bondage. They started to believe the lie that bondage equaled security and that was all that they deserved. Slowly, they grew numb to the true and the good and the beautiful. And eventually they forgot that they were made for more, just like we do. That's why the Apostle Paul repeatedly states that we are slaves to sin. We fall into the slavery and false narratives of our brokenness. And as difficult as wilderness experiences can be, I think this is part of the promise that they hold. The Exodus story reminds us that there are powers outside of us that are seeking to enslave us. And wilderness journeys, they lead us into dealing with our hearts in some deep ways. A number of years ago, some of us read through C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters, together. And if you're familiar with it or not familiar with it, it's a collection of fictional letters that are written by a demon called Screwtape. And he's writing to his nephew named Wormwood. And Screwtape is trying to teach his nephew how to enslave human beings, how to enslave your human victims and steal them away from the enemy, referencing God. And here is one of his bits of advice for Wormwood. This is how he says, this is how we ensnare these humans.
Never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. I know that we have won many a soul through pleasure. All the same, it is his invention, not ours. He made all the pleasures. All our research so far has not enabled us to produce one. All we can do is to encourage the humans to take pleasures which our enemy has produced, at times or in ways or in degrees which he has forbidden, taking them too far, distorting them. Hence, we always try to work away from the natural condition of any pleasure to that in which it is least natural, least redolent of its maker, and least pleasurable, twisted, broken.
Part of what Lewis is highlighting here is that human brokenness it's a really complex reality. It's ultimately being separated from our Creator and losing our true identity. It's not just about individual sins, but about a deeper brokenness that carries a huge deception. At some level, we are all victims. Remember the story of Exodus. God doesn't start blaming the Israelites for getting themselves into this mess in Egypt. Oh, you guys, you should have known better. Instead, he just rescues them. And it's the pattern that we see emerge throughout the Bible story. It's this beautiful pattern of grace. He tells us that on some level, we're victims. In some way, we've been enslaved. So it's all right to cry out in frustration and pain. It's all right to feel lost and hopeless. But it's also all right to hope. The story reminds us that God is a God who responds and that he is a God that rescues. We can feel trapped in so many ways. People can feel trapped in their jobs. They can feel trapped in bad relationships. They can feel trapped in family patterns. They can feel trapped in a body that they don't like. They can feel trapped by their income, and it doesn't matter if it's a big income, that can trap you just as easily as a small one. And at a time and place where we have some of the greatest freedoms that people have ever experienced on planet Earth, so many people are feeling trapped, enslaved, stuck in a life that in some way doesn't feel right. Can we see part of ourselves in this story? Can we embrace the wilderness journey? I think the Exodus journey is for each and every one of us. We all need rescue at some level. We all need God's grace to set us free at some level, and that's okay. We should be encouraged by the example of Jesus, who himself embraced the wilderness journey. Again, Matthew 2, this was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Out of Egypt. When that prophecy was given, the first Christian audience that was predominantly Jewish, every original Jewish reader, seeing that in Matthew's gospel, would have known exactly what that meant. They'd understand that Jesus was doing a new thing. It was a new Exodus. They had been under oppression for so long, and here's Jesus, and he's come out of Egypt. This is the long-awaited new Exodus that is going to lead a broken and uncertain people towards the long-awaited promised land. Everyone who has experienced brokenness or hurt or fear can find hope. This is our story. Out of Egypt, God still calls his sons and daughters. And next week, we are going to be jumping back to another Engage Sunday. But as we get back to I guess, more typical Sundays, I'm going to hopefully reflect on the wilderness journey and the story of Exodus in Egypt and how that plays out in our lives. So that's the direction I'm hoping and thinking of going. But I want to finish this too by pointing out, I'd never seen this before. One of my devotionals this week pointed it out. But even the story before Jesus starts his ministry, where he has these 40 days of trial in the desert, we get the big three challenges of Satan, turn the rock into bread, throw yourself off the Temple Mount. Those three things, and it's like, and Jesus stood his ground, and Jesus stood his ground, and Jesus stood his ground, and it's like the end. And then Jesus starts his ministry. But it's not the end. You read the account in Matthew 2, and it's only one verse. It's only one verse. But as soon as the devil leaves, as soon as Jesus overcomes, it says, like instantly, they were angels come and minister to Jesus. Jesus was not facing this trial on his own. God was with him the whole time. These angels were on standby. And the second that they were needed, heaven rushed to meet Jesus, to nourish his heart, to nourish his soul, to strengthen him. And I think that too is a promise for us, especially, in these days where things are weary, where we're tired, where things are hard, where we face challenge. God is not far away. We maybe can't see it forefront, but heaven is right there. And God's heart is right there. And right there, he wants to break in and bring comfort and bring encouragement. And I guess my prayer for us is that we will see that, remember that, recognize that. I'm also, for this week anyways, we'll see how it goes, but I have some homework for you guys. But I'm not going to give it to you now. It's Sunday. You can enjoy the rest of the day. No homework today, but I'm going to post it on the Facebook group page tomorrow. So you can choose to engage the homework to whatever degree you like, but there will be a number of questions. Once we get the teaching up on YouTube, if you want to review it, whatever, to inspire some of your thinking, you can. But that will be coming, so you can take a watch for that. But with that, I think I'm just going to pray. I'm going to take a minute too, where we're just going to, give an opportunity for God to speak to each of our hearts, and then we'll see how the rest of the morning goes. Lord Jesus, sometimes life feels chaotic, Lord. It's, I think James talks about, that little boat being tossed and beaten around on the waves. And that is often how we feel, Lord. Just when we think that we're steady in you, just when we think we've got a grasp of reality, just when we think we can make sense of things, something disorients us. An outside factor disorients us, or our own internal brokenness stirs the waters, makes things muddy, and makes things confusing. And it's like, oh gosh, here we go, Lord. We thought we were making progress, and now look at me. But Lord, that's just a part of life on this planet. It's not an indicator that we are broken, that we are flawed. Lord, your heart for us is good and true and beautiful. And Lord, I pray that we would remember our true identity. I pray, Lord, that we would remember our true calling and what you are bringing us towards. I pray, Lord, that we would be inspired and encouraged by that, especially, Lord, in the seasons where we're disoriented. So, Jesus, I do once again just invite you to come speak to us, speak to our hearts. If there's anything particularly, Lord, that you want to highlight from the past week or as we prepare to head into the next. Is there some part of life, Lord, that you want to highlight to us? Is there some way that you want to remind us that you are with us?